First, I'd like to thank Lev and Noah for inviting me. For a while, I was wondering, I'm an historian. I'm a refugee from a 1960s area studies program, thinking that here I am moving to a different studies program, being somewhat misplaced. But Michael's talk actually kind of summed up some of the things I have to say. And point I'd like to get across, I'm thinking about how history is a media. And one of the problems of history, and the reason why history has become so insignificant, is the conflation of history and the past. In order to do that, then, I'd like to think about how we think about history as historical, and time also as historical, as a way then to unpack how we might bring, in my mind, the humanities, but also the social sciences and some of the sciences into, or I should say, add to it a conceptualization of time that removes us from classical time or Newtonian time, 17th century time. So what I'd like to, where I begin a lot of my work is thinking about if history is a media. This is a wonderful statement that I like from Norbert Elias that reminds me that we're at a moment now, and I think when we hear about the computer being new, revolutionary, and all of these kind of, and I'm particularly concerned about publications and media and the humanities and history. When we talk about this as new, we're talking about it within an idiom of modernity, as if it's something different, but at the same time, we need to also consider something that Norbert Elias is saying, is that perhaps this whole idiom of newness itself is something that needs to be rethought. So the way that I do it then is to think about history as historical. One of the I think about history as historical in two ways. The first way is the way we understand history, in that the way that we practice and write history is something that came into being in the 19th century. It's a narrative, a causal narrative that's linear and lays one after another, and the simplistic way, or the simple way that historians do it, is to chain data by dates together. Okay? Another way that history is historical, though, is that history is an epistemology by which modern life has become temporally organized using abstract spatial categories. And we've known this for a long time, in a sense, because philosophers of history, intellectual historians, have written about different moments when history becomes historical. But the phrase that I wanted to bring this to is Thomas Carlyle. I think it was in a direct criticism of von Ranke, who gives rise to this kind of dry laboratory-like history that we practice, reacts that things done are in a series, or are not in a series, but in a group. In other words, our lives, the way things happen, is not linear, but we write about them as if they're linear. And the result, this is where we conflate history and time together. And my goal then is one of the things that I'm trying to do is to think about what the problems of that conflation have been, and then how can we get outside of it. Okay. Donald Wilcox, who has written this wonderful book, trying to think about this about 30 years ago, we are so accustomed to apply absolute time to the quotidian details of life, we do not really appreciate the extent to which it changes the focus of identity, depersonalizing historical realities, removing them from immediate contact with life. In other words, history as a discipline that says it's going to talk about life and what happened is always using categories and forms of knowledge that separates itself from life. So one way that I like to do that is to think about time, too, as something that's historical. With Jeff Bowker, we've created a class on the history of time as a way of talking about it and thinking about this. But the time that I'm thinking about as being historical is the time of, what we use is the Newtonian absolute time, absolute space. And I'm thinking, I'm very behind in all of these things, but I'm trying to think about how can we imagine a history in Einsteinian time rather than 17th century Newtonian time. And in that sense, we know that time is historical, but our social structures are based upon this. Michel Serres talks about the way that we think about development and progress as a race. And for me, being a refugee of area studies, I find that this is a perfect way to think about some fundamental problematics of non-Western places, as well as the area studies programs that describe them. And I think it's also applicable to developmental studies, the history of childhood, on and on and on. And then I worry about this when, you know, I might be a closet Marxist in some sense. And I think Marx is right here when he's talking about time in modern society, or modern society being inflected through time. I hope Marx is not right, because the flip side of this, Jeff Bowker just sent me a site on a program for getting things done. It's this, the new age, I just see it as a new age tailorization of the mind. And that's how we're kind of getting things done, is to become more efficient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And most of us, you know, we all know that the more efficient we become, the less time we have. So then the last part of this that I'm trying to think about is how new media is a way to think about this, because one of the problems is that the way that we write history, the way that we academics practice, the way we give talks, is very linear and very, you know, straightforward. It's very difficult to give a kind of a multilinear, it's very difficult to listen to as well, multilinear kind of networked kind of talk. But I think about this then in terms of history. I'm like David Levy's work, Scrolling Forward, and Carla Hesse, thinking about history, the way we write, the publishing system, the way we think, is all part of this modern literary system. And my goal then is to think about how we might write a history that is a history of time spaces, or that's distributed, networked, and interactive rather than causal. And the way that I is trying to do it is I'm trying to think about it using the Bolter and Grusin notion of remediation, to think about history both as a narrative and as an epistemology, as something that needs to be remediated, where we could bring different kinds of data together with categories and narratives about those. Thank you.